They thought she wouldn't notice, that a 10-year-old wouldn't see the silent tension, the reaching hand, the flash of fury aimed at a man who had done nothing but follow his orders. They were wrong, because when the Queen Consort raised her hand, not in ceremony, not in welcome, but in anger, it wasn't a guard who stopped her, it was Princess Charlotte. Before I show you how the future of the monarchy stood between a soldier and a scandal, make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from, and share this with someone who believes courage has nothing to do with age and everything to do with knowing what's right. Because what happened next, no one could have predicted it. The October air at Clarence House carried that particular London chill that makes tourists pull their coats tighter and locals just walk faster. Amber leaves crunched under the feet of schoolchildren lined up behind velvet ropes, their small hands clutching miniature Union Jacks that fluttered like nervous birds in the breeze. It was supposed to be simple, a photo opportunity. Queen Consort Camilla presenting a ceremonial donation to a children's hospice, with Princess Charlotte beside her to sweeten the headlines. The kind of event that fills royal calendars between the real business of state visits and constitutional duties. Sergeant Ellis Warwick knew better than to trust simple. He stood 32 paces from the raised stone platform, Coldstream Guard uniform pressed to knife-edge perfection, rifle cradled at his shoulder with the kind of stillness that made tourists wonder if he was actually breathing. 6'3" in his boots, with the particular kind of alertness that came from places where paying attention meant coming home alive. 2 tours in Helmand had given him those eyes, the ones that caught movement before it happened, that read crowds like other people read newspapers. The doctor said he'd earned his retirement after the roadside bomb left shrapnel near his spine, but Ellis chose the bearskin instead, because he remembered Lance Corporal Davies. Davies had been 3 weeks from rotation when he'd accepted a simple assignment, escorting a diplomatic convoy to what everyone called a safe compound. No hostile activity in the area for months. Easy duty. The kind of assignment you gave to soldiers who'd done their time in the dangerous places. The improvised explosive device that killed Davies and 2 others had been buried under a road that had been cleared every day for 6 months. Safe, right up until it wasn't. Ellis learned something that day that most people never understood. Danger doesn't disappear when you put it in a prettier setting. It just gets better at hiding. And the moment you start treating protocol like a suggestion instead of a lifeline, people die. Maybe not from bombs, maybe not with blood and smoke, but they die all the same, a little piece at a time, every time someone with authority decides that rules don't apply to them. Today, that old instinct was humming like a live wire. Nothing he could name, just small details that didn't quite fit. The way one of the junior aides kept pacing near the press line, checking his watch every 30 seconds. How the Royal Protection Officers seemed more tense than usual for a children's charity event. The fact that there were more photographers than normal, positioned with the kind of intention that suggested they knew something was about to happen. On the platform, Queen Camilla smiled for the cameras with practiced warmth, sapphire brooch catching the afternoon light. But Ellis noticed how her fingers gripped her cue cards just a little too tightly. How her eyes kept flicking toward the rope barriers with something that looked almost like irritation. Beside her, Princess Charlotte sat with the composed stillness of someone who'd been performing in public since before she could walk properly. 10 years old, powder blue coat, buttoned neat as a pin, hands folded in her lap like she was posing for a portrait. But she wasn't watching the cameras or the crowd, she was watching him. Their eyes met for just a moment across the courtyard. Charlotte didn't smile or wave. That wasn't her role right now, but something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The kind that happens between people who understand what it means to do your job properly, even when everyone else wants you to do it differently. Ellis returned his gaze to the perimeter, but that feeling in his chest had started ticking like a timer counting down. The trouble would start small, it always did, and when it came, he'd be ready. The first test came disguised as a simple request. A junior aide in a navy suit approached from the press section, clipboard clutched against his chest like armour. He had the nervous energy of someone carrying a message he didn't quite believe in. "They need the press line moved forward," he said to the Royal Protection Officer, stationed near the west barrier. 3 feet. The lens angle's cutting off the platform edge. The officer didn't even blink. "Protocol says the line holds." "They've cleared it with media operations." "Then media ops can clear it with security command. Until then, the perimeter stands." The aide's jaw tightened. He turned toward Ellis instead, probably figuring a ceremonial guard would be easier to push around than armed security. "Sergeant, we need you to help adjust the rope line." Just a small shift forward. Ellis didn't move. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd learned not to negotiate with bad ideas. This position was set by Royal Protection Command at 13:10 hours. Any changes require authorization from Major Loughton. "We're talking about 3 feet. "We're talking about protocol, sir." The aide's mouth opened, then closed. He wasn't used to being told no by people he considered decorative. After a moment, he turned and walked away, clipboard pressed against his chest like he was protecting vital organs. But Ellis caught the quick gesture toward his earpiece as he retreated. The whispered conversation, the glance back over his shoulder. What the aide didn't say, what he couldn't say in front of cameras, was that this had nothing to do with photo angles. 3 different media outlets had been promised unprecedented access to today's event. Access that depended on getting specific shots from specific angles. The kind of access that got paid for in advance, with invoices already sent and expectations already set. Ellis had unknowingly positioned himself in the exact spot that would ruin a £50,000 photography package. Not because he was incompetent, but because he was doing his job exactly as trained, following the security perimeter to the letter, regardless of what it cost the palace's media relations. In the aide's earpiece, a voice was already demanding answers. "Why is the guard still there?" "We paid for clear sightlines." The aide couldn't explain that the guard was following actual protocol instead of the modified version they'd hoped to implement quietly. Couldn't admit that they'd assumed a ceremonial soldier would be easier to move than proper security. This wasn't over. On the platform, Queen Camilla's smile had paused for just a fraction of a second, long enough for someone paying attention to notice the irritation flickering behind her eyes before the practiced warmth returned. Charlotte had noticed too. She shifted slightly in her chair, not enough to break her composed posture, but enough to get a better view of what was happening below. She didn't need to understand the specifics to see the shape of it. Adults trying to make someone do something they shouldn't do. It was a lesson she'd learned early in palaces. Power didn't always announce itself with crowns and ceremonies. Sometimes it came quietly, wearing expensive suits, carrying clipboards, speaking in polite voices that weren't really polite at all. Another aide approached 10 minutes later. This one was older, balding, with the particular confidence that came from 30 years of making other people's problems disappear. He gestured at the velvet rope and said something to the uniformed steward beside it. The steward shook his head. The aide's hand moved toward the barrier like he might adjust it himself. "Sir!" Ellis's voice cut across the courtyard like a rifle shot. "Please don't touch the cordon." The man looked up, eyebrows raised in the universal expression of someone who couldn't believe he was being questioned by the help. "Excuse me. That line defines the operational perimeter. Moving it violates the safety zone established by Royal Protection Command. I'll need confirmation from Major Loughton before any adjustments are authorized." There was a long pause, the kind that builds before someone decides whether to escalate or retreat. The aide's face cycled through several expressions before settling on tight-lipped frustration. "This is absurd," he muttered, but he stepped back from the rope. This time, Camilla didn't hide her reaction. She leaned toward one of her ladies-in-waiting and whispered something sharp enough to make the woman's eyebrows lift. Both of them looked toward Ellis, with expressions that could have frozen the Thames. Above them, Charlotte's shoulders had drawn slightly tighter. She kept her eyes forward, but Ellis could feel her attention like a weight. She was watching, learning, filing away the details of what happened when someone tried to do their job right in a world that preferred convenient shortcuts. Charlotte had seen this pattern before, in quieter moments behind palace walls. The way certain staff members would suddenly become difficult to work with when they wouldn't bend rules that weren't supposed to bend. how security officers would find themselves reassigned after refusing to look the other way on protocol violations. The subtle but systematic removal of people who prioritize duty over convenience. She'd heard the grown-up conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, whispered complaints about guards who didn't understand their place in the new order. The careful distinction between ceremonial duties and real security, as if protecting dignity and tradition was somehow less important than protecting buildings and bodies. At 10 years old, Charlotte might not have understood the politics, but she understood the pattern. Good people got pushed aside when they wouldn't compromise. And once they were gone, the next person faced the same choice: bend or break. She'd watched her grandfather navigate these pressures his entire life. The constant tension between doing what was right and doing what was expedient. The way principle became a luxury when public relations demanded flexibility. But she'd also learned something else from watching her grandfather, that sometimes the smallest gesture at the right moment could change everything. That leadership wasn't about having the most power. It was about knowing when to use whatever power you had. Ellis's pulse had settled back to baseline, but his jaw remained tight beneath the shadow of his bare skin. The probes weren't random. They were systematic, testing his resolve, looking for the point where he'd bend rather than hold the line. They'd picked the wrong soldier for that experiment, and they were about to find out why. When Queen Camilla stood up from her chair, it should have been the gentle transition into the programme's next phase. A moment of unscripted warmth for the cameras as she descended to greet the children from the hospice. The kind of spontaneous gesture that publicists loved and security officers quietly dreaded. But there was nothing gentle about the way she smoothed her cream coat or the sharp edge in her voice when she turned to her senior aide. "I'd like to greet the children personally," she said. It wasn't really a request. The aide stiffened. "Ma'am, that would require repositioning the security perimeter." "Then reposition it." Her tone could have cut glass. "I won't have this moment ruined by excessive ceremony." She didn't wait for a response. She was already moving toward the steps. The senior aide practically sprinted down from the platform, his colleague flanking him as they made a beeline for the rope barrier. This wasn't a polite request anymore. This was damage control in real time, with cameras rolling and a reputation to protect. They reached Ellis's position, and the lead aide barely slowed down. "Sergeant, Her Majesty is coming forward to greet the children. We need a 10-foot corridor through this line immediately." Ellis didn't blink. "That cannot happen without perimeter rescan and security clearance. This is a ceremonial event. This is a live operational zone, sir. Modifying it requires chain of command authorization." The second aide stepped closer, his professional composure starting to crack. "You're joking." "She's the Queen Consort." "She's also under protection protocol," Ellis replied, with the same calm he'd used to report contact in Sangin. "And my orders are non-negotiable without proper authorization." The first aide glanced desperately toward the platform, where Camilla had reached the bottom of the steps and was clearly expecting the path to be clear. When he looked back at Ellis, his voice had dropped to something between pleading and threatening. "You've done this before. You made difficulties during the flower ceremony last month. The household staff were not pleased." Ellis had heard the whispers. The difficult one. The soldier who forgot the war was over. But the job hadn't changed just because the scenery had gotten prettier. He didn't protect feelings, he protected people. "I follow written instructions, sir. That's all." But even as he said it, Ellis could see the shift in their faces. They weren't arguing about security anymore. They were arguing about authority, about who got to decide when rules mattered and when they didn't. And that argument was about to get very personal. Behind them, Camilla's heel tapped against stone as she waited for a path that wasn't coming. The aide's voice hardened. "You're forcing us to escalate this, Sergeant." "I'm doing my job." Nothing more. From her chair on the platform, Charlotte watched it all unfold, with the particular clarity that children sometimes have for adult foolishness. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language perfectly. The way the aides leaned forward like they were trying to push through an invisible wall. The way the guard remained perfectly still, unmoved and unmovable. The way her grandmother stood at the bottom of the steps, clearly expecting someone to fix this problem immediately. Charlotte had spent enough time in palaces to recognize the moment when politeness stopped being polite. When adult voices got that particular edge that meant someone was about to get hurt. She shifted in her chair, not enough to break protocol, but enough to see everything clearly, because something told her she was going to need to remember exactly how this happened. Camilla didn't call for him to move, didn't issue an order or make a formal request or even raise her voice. She simply walked across the cobblestones towards Sergeant Ellis Warwick, with the measured pace of someone who'd spent decades having doors opened before she reached them. Her cream coat caught the afternoon breeze, and her heels clicked against stone with the rhythm of absolute certainty. Except she wasn't walking toward the children anymore. She was walking toward the man who'd said no. Ellis registered the approach the way he'd learned to, in places where the wrong reaction could get everyone killed. Weight balanced, breathing controlled, eyes tracking movement without shifting position. The cameras caught it immediately. Shutters started clicking like rapid-fire prayers. A BBC microphone swiveled toward the developing confrontation. Behind the rope line, tourists began pulling out phones, sensing that something was happening beyond the usual pageantry. One woman whispered to her husband in hushed German. A group of teenagers stopped taking selfies and started filming instead. Charlotte leaned forward in her chair. Camilla stopped within arm's reach of the guard line. When she spoke, her voice was low enough not to carry to the press, but clear enough that every word landed like a hammer blow. "Sergeant, you are obstructing my engagement," Ellis responded without turning his head. "Ma'am, I'm following orders to maintain this perimeter until security authorizes any changes." "You were told this was cleared?" "I was told to break protocol, which I cannot do." Her smile had vanished entirely now. "You're a ceremonial guard, not a commanding officer." "I'm a serving member of the Household Division operating under direct instruction from Royal Protection Command," he replied, with the flat precision of someone reciting regulations under fire. The aide behind her actually winced. More cameras were turning now. The casual observers near the rope line had picked up their phones. Someone muttered, "What's happening?" in a thick American accent that carried further than intended. Camilla's voice sharpened like a blade being drawn. "You've embarrassed this household for the last time." Ellis might as well have been carved from the same stone as the building behind him. "My job is to secure this space, ma'am, not decorate it." That was the moment something shifted in her expression. Not quite rage, not exactly humiliation, but something smaller and more dangerous. The particular fury of someone whose authority had been questioned in public by someone who wouldn't flinch. Her hand, which had been gesturing toward the platform, hung in the air a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Ellis saw the change, the coiled tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled slightly, as if muscle memory was taking over from conscious thought. From the platform, Charlotte stood up. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't check with anyone for permission. She simply rose from her chair and began walking toward the steps with the same calm determination she'd shown all afternoon. Camilla's hand lifted higher. Every camera in the courtyard swiveled toward the movement, and somewhere in that space between impulse and action, between authority and accountability, the Queen Consort's hand drew back like she was preparing to teach someone a lesson about respect. The child was already moving to stop her. Time seemed to slow down in the way it does before accidents, when everyone can see what's about to happen, but no one can quite believe it. Camilla's hand hung suspended at shoulder height, fingers not quite curled into a fist, but something tighter than gesture. Her face had gone beyond irritation into territory that palace staff were trained never to see, raw, unguarded anger at being defied in public. Sergeant Warwick stood perfectly still, not because he was frozen, but because he'd learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the best response to incoming fire was to make yourself the smallest possible target. His breathing had slowed to combat rhythm. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead. But in his peripheral vision, he could see everything. The raised hand, the taut muscles, the split-second calculation happening behind Camilla's eyes as royal training warred with human impulse. She was going to do it. Not because she was cruel, not because she enjoyed violence, but because in that moment, all the careful protocols and media training and decades of public composure had collapsed into something much simpler. Someone had embarrassed her, and she was going to make them pay for it. The cameras were already rolling, lenses focused, shutters clicking in rapid succession as photographers sensed the exact moment when ceremony became something else entirely. And then a small hand reached out and caught her wrist. Not roughly, not dramatically, just a child's fingers closing gently but firmly around her grandmother's arm, stopping the motion as naturally as catching a falling glass. The sound that went up from the crowd was unlike anything Ellis had heard in 12 years of ceremonial duty. Not cheers or gasps, but something more primal. The collective intake of breath that happens when everyone realizes they're witnessing something they'll never forget. Princess Charlotte had crossed the courtyard and climbed down from the platform so quietly that most people hadn't even noticed her moving. Now she stood directly beside Camilla, powder blue coat brushing against cream, small hand wrapped around a wrist that had been aimed at a guard's face. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Please don't." 2 words, soft as silk. But they cut through the afternoon air like a blade through water, silencing everything and everyone. Camilla looked down at her granddaughter with an expression somewhere between shock and something that might have been shame. Her arm went slack immediately, the fight draining out of her like air from a punctured balloon. Ellis didn't move, couldn't move. His training told him to remain at attention, but something deeper than training was telling him he was watching history being written by the smallest person in the courtyard. Charlotte didn't let go immediately. She held her grandmother's wrist for just a moment longer, making sure the danger had passed. Then her hand fell away, but she didn't step back. Instead, she turned toward Ellis. She looked up at him, up at a man over twice her height, encased in scarlet and steel, trained to be as immovable as the building behind him. But when their eyes met, there was no fear in her face, no uncertainty, just recognition, one person acknowledging another. "Thank you for doing your job," she said simply. Ellis couldn't respond. His role didn't permit words outside of direct commands, but something in his posture eased, not enough for cameras to catch, but enough that Charlotte could see it. She turned back to face Camilla, who was still standing frozen at the base of the platform steps. Charlotte's voice remained soft, still child-sized, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. "You're not allowed to do that." Not accusing, not defiant, just stating a fact that everyone in the courtyard already knew, but no one had been willing to say out loud. Camilla's lips parted, but no sound came out. Around them, journalists were scribbling notes they didn't know how to phrase. Headlines were being written without verbs. Camera operators kept filming because they didn't know how to stop, even though they weren't sure what they were capturing anymore. Charlotte didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked back toward the platform with the same measured dignity she'd shown all afternoon. Not hurried, not flustered, just a child who'd done what needed doing and was now returning to her proper place. But before she climbed the stairs, she paused, just for a moment. She looked back at Ellis one more time, not with admiration or hero worship, but with something deeper. The acknowledgement that passes between people who understand what it means to hold the line when everyone else wants you to give ground. Then she was gone, climbing the stone steps back to her seat. And Camilla was left standing exactly where she was, watching her granddaughter walk away and realizing that the 10-year-old in the powder blue coat had just given her a lesson in leadership that 30 years of royal training never had. The silence stretched on until someone in the crowd whispered, "Jesus Christ," loud enough for the microphones to catch. And Sergeant Ellis Warwick remained exactly where he'd been the entire time, at his post, holding the line, no longer standing alone. What happened next would be talked about for decades. Not because royal protocol had been broken, but because it had been corrected by someone who understood better than anyone that real authority comes from doing what's right, not from doing what's convenient. The crowd didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent, so they did both. A scattered clapping that started and started again, like people trying to find the rhythm of something they'd never experienced before. Prince William had watched it all unfold from his seat on the platform. Now he stood and walked to the edge of the steps, his expression unreadable, but his posture speaking volumes. When he reached Charlotte, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, not restraining her, not correcting her, just acknowledging what she'd done. Then he continued down to ground level. The aides scattered like startled birds as he approached. They'd pushed and manoeuvred and threatened their way into a confrontation that had exploded in their faces, and now they wanted to be anywhere else but standing near the wreckage. William stopped beside Camilla, who was still frozen at the bottom of the platform steps. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was brittle as winter glass. "This has gotten completely out of control." William didn't raise his voice, didn't need to, only because it wasn't handled properly from the beginning. He was insubordinate. He was following his orders, just like Charlotte was following hers. Camilla's mouth opened, but William had already turned away. He walked over to where Ellis stood at perfect attention and looked him directly in the eye. Then he gave a single sharp nod, the kind that passes between people who understand what duty actually means. "Resume your post, Sergeant." Ellis's response carried clearly across the courtyard. "Yes, sir." William returned to the platform. Camilla followed a moment later, her heels clicking against stone, like punctuation marks on a sentence no one wanted to finish. The ceremony resumed with the awkward rhythm of machinery remembering how to function after an unexpected shutdown. The children's choir picked up their interrupted song. Officials shuffled papers and pretended nothing had happened. Cameras panned back toward the platform, where normal pageantry was supposed to be occurring. But normal had left the building. Everyone in that courtyard, from the tourists pressed against the barriers to the seasoned journalists with their telephoto lenses, knew they'd witnessed something that would be discussed in pubs and dinner tables and university lecture halls for years to come. Not because a princess had broken protocol, but because she'd understood something that all the adults around her had forgotten, that protecting people who can't protect themselves isn't optional. It's not something you do when it's convenient or when the cameras aren't rolling. It's something you do because it's right. Charlotte sat through the rest of the ceremony with the same composed dignity she'd shown all afternoon. But twice more before the event ended, she glanced toward Ellis's position, not checking on him. He clearly didn't need checking on, just making sure he knew he wasn't forgotten. The second time, she gave the smallest possible nod, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, just for him. Ellis didn't nod back. That wouldn't have been appropriate. But his breathing settled into the easy rhythm of someone who no longer had to carry the weight of standing alone against institutional pressure. When the final notes faded, and the last photograph was taken, the crowd began to disperse with the usual mixture of satisfaction and excitement. They'd gotten their pictures and their memories. Most would go home happy with their glimpse of royal tradition. But some would go home with something more, the knowledge that they'd seen courage in its purest form. The kind that doesn't announce itself with speeches or grand gestures. The kind that simply steps forward when stepping forward matters, regardless of the consequences. As the ceremonial equipment was packed away and the barriers were finally moved, now that it didn't matter anymore, Ellis allowed himself a moment of reflection. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that the hardest battles weren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they were fought in silence, with nothing but conviction, and the hope that someone, somewhere, would notice when you refused to surrender ground that shouldn't be surrendered. Today, someone had noticed. Someone had stepped forward when it mattered most. And now every guard in the British Army knew that holding the line wasn't a solitary duty anymore. Sometimes, if you were lucky, you got backup from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, if you were very lucky, that backup was 10 years old and absolutely fearless. What would you have done if you'd been standing in that courtyard? Do you think Charlotte went too far or not far enough? And how many other people are holding the line somewhere right now, waiting for someone to notice that they shouldn't have to stand alone? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you think a 10-year-old princess was right to grab her grandmother's wrist in front of the world's cameras. If this story reminds you why quiet courage matters more than loud authority, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. Because moments like this deserve to be remembered. Share this with someone who needs to remember that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear powder blue coats and understand that protecting people is never optional. Your next story is waiting right there on screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that the most important stands are usually the quietest ones.